11:41. At night on a Sunday in July of 2026, the seafloor let go 219 kilometers southwest of Port Hardy, 10 kilometers down under open ocean off the northern tip of Vancouver Island. A magnitude 5. 6 earthquake, ruptured with no meaningful foreshock, no warning, just a sudden release of stress that had been building in the crust for an unknown stretch of time. And then, in under a minute, it was over, the way most earthquakes are over. But the ripples from that 1 minute didn't stay local. Earthquakes Canada logged the shaking as far away as Metro Vancouver, more than 450 kilometers to the southeast. People in Campbell River felt it. People in Port Alberni felt it. And within hours, seismologists who study this stretch of coastline were doing something the public rarely gets to watch happen in real time, treating a single moderate earthquake as a genuine data point in one of the most closely monitored natural experiments on the planet. That's worth unpacking, because a 5.6 sounds modest next to the earthquakes that make international headlines. What makes this one different is where it happened. This wasn't a random patch of ocean. It struck almost exactly at the meeting point of some of the most geologically tangled, most actively studied, and frankly, strangest tectonic real estate in North America, a place where a subduction zone appears to be in the process of coming apart, and where a much larger, much older hazard has been quietly loading stress along the coast since long before anyone had instruments to measure it. Start with the plain facts, because they're worth having, straight before the interpretation comes in. The quake struck at roughly 11:41 p.m. Pacific time, at a depth of about 10 kilometers beneath the ocean floor, shallow to intermediate by seismic standards. The epicenter sat about 219 kilometers southwest of Port Hardy, well offshore, away from any population center, out where the seafloor drops into the true depths of the Northeast Pacific. Earthquakes Canada, the federal agency responsible for monitoring seismic activity across the country, confirmed there was no tsunami risk associated with the event. That detail matters, and it tells scientists something specific about the type of rupture involved, not just that people got lucky. Despite being centered so far offshore, the shaking reached an unusually wide area. Northern Vancouver Island reported it directly. Reports came in from Campbell River, roughly 300 kilometers from the epicenter, and from Port Alberni, about 330 kilometers away. Remarkably, the tremor reached Metro Vancouver itself, more than 450 kilometers to the southeast, for what was only a magnitude 5. 6. That's a wide felt radius, and it's a reminder that how strongly an earthquake is felt at the surface depends on more than the number attached to it. It depends on depth, on the type of faulting, on the rock the seismic waves pass through, and on the exact geometry of the rupture. A shallow offshore quake in a region with particular crustal properties can carry energy much farther than an identical magnitude event somewhere else. If this had happened in an otherwise quiet stretch of coastline, it might have warranted a local news mention and nothing more. Earthquakes happen constantly, and most don't matter beyond their immediate area. But this one didn't occur in isolation, and it didn't occur somewhere scientists consider unremarkable. To understand why, you have to zoom out and look at the broader map of plates along the Pacific Northwest coast. Most people who've heard anything about earthquake risk in this part of the world have heard of the Cascadia subduction zone, the roughly 700-mile fault system running from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, where the oceanic Juan de Fuca plate is being forced beneath the continental North American plate. This is the subduction zone responsible for the catastrophic magnitude 9 earthquake that struck on January 26, 1700, an event massive enough to generate a tsunami that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck Japan without any local shaking being felt there, which is part of how researchers were later able to pin down the exact date. That event lives on today in the oral histories and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples along the coast, and in physical evidence still visible in the landscape, including the stands of saltwater-killed trees that dot the coastline, sometimes called ghost forests, standing as silent markers of sudden land subsidence more than 3 centuries ago. Since that 1700 rupture, the Cascadia subduction zone has been unusually, and to researchers somewhat unnervingly, quiet. Large earthquakes on this fault have been scarce, which sounds like good news until you understand how subduction zones actually behave. Stress doesn't simply vanish. When 2 plates are locked together and one is being forced beneath the other, friction accumulates, strain over time, the way a spring wind's tighter the longer it's held. That strain has to go somewhere eventually, either released gradually in smaller events or released all at once in a rupture large enough to move the entire locked section of the fault. The long, quiet stretch since 1700 is part of why this region is considered, in a probabilistic sense, overdue for another major rupture, and it's a big part of why any seismic activity near this zone draws close scrutiny, even when, as with this particular quake, the earthquake itself isn't happening on the main megathrust fault. And that's a crucial piece of context here. This magnitude, 5. 6 earthquake did not occur on the main Cascadia megathrust. the flat, gently dipping fault where the Juan de Fuca plate slides beneath North America, and where the big one is expected to eventually happen. It occurred farther out, closer to the surface expression of a different, and in some ways even more structurally chaotic feature. The boundary zone where the Juan de Fuca plate meets a smaller, less famous piece of oceanic crust called the Explorer plate. This is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint, and it's why researchers weren't simply logging this as a routine entry in a catalog. The Explorer plate is a relatively small fragment of oceanic crust sitting off the northern end of Vancouver Island, wedged between the larger Juan de Fuca plate to its south and the Pacific plate to its west. For a long time, the Explorer plate and the Juan de Fuca plate were treated as essentially one continuous system. But modern geophysical work has made it increasingly clear that they behave as distinct blocks, each with its own motion, its own subduction behavior, and its own internal deformation. Separating them, or more precisely acting as the transform boundary between them, is a structure called the Nootka Fault Zone, a band of intensely tangled deformation that cuts across the seafloor almost exactly where this earthquake occurred. Recent research into the Nootka Fault Zone has revealed something scientists didn't fully appreciate until very recently. Using deep seismic reflection imaging, essentially a sonic technique that works something like an ultrasound of the Earth's crust, combined with large catalogs of earthquake data collected over years, researchers have found that this fault zone isn't a simple, narrow crack. It's a broad belt of active deformation, roughly 20 kilometers wide, riddled with fractures that cut down through the sediment layer, through the crust itself, and into the upper mantle beneath. Earthquakes cluster densely along these fractures. Some of the individual faults within the zone appear to be ancient structures, originally formed millions of years ago as ordinary faults near an old spreading ridge, that have since been reactivated and repurposed as the regional tectonic setting evolved around them. In plain terms, the crust in this specific patch of ocean floor has been stretched, broken, stitched back together by new stress patterns, and broken again repeatedly over an enormous span of geological time. And it's still actively doing that today. This isn't a quiet, simple slab of rock sliding calmly beneath the continent. It's a genuinely messy, fractured, still evolving piece of the planet's crust. And every earthquake that occurs there hands researchers another data point they can use to refine exactly how that mess is structured. There's a larger scientific story sitting behind all of this, one that has generated real excitement in the earth science community over roughly the past year. Researchers working with data from a major expedition called the Cascadia Seismic Imaging Experiment, conducted in 2021 aboard a research vessel, have been publishing results describing something remarkable happening at the northern end of the Cascadia system. Using a 15-kilometer-long array of underwater sensors towed behind the ship, combined with sound wave imaging techniques and a deep well of regional earthquake records, the research team, led by a scientist at a major Earth observatory, produced the clearest images yet of what's actually happening to the subducting plate beneath this stretch of ocean floor. What they found is that the plate isn't simply diving smoothly beneath North America, the way subduction zones are often drawn in simplified textbook diagrams. It's tearing. The images reveal steep fractures where the downgoing slab suddenly steps downward by several kilometers, almost like a staircase rather than a smooth ramp. Chains of earthquakes line up precisely along these fracture zones, forming what researchers describe as near vertical walls of seismic activity reaching down to roughly 40 kilometers in depth. The interpretation is that these are literal tears ripping through the sinking oceanic plate as it's forced underground, and one tear in particular, located beneath the Explorer microplate, appears especially well developed, well advanced in the process of separating. The explanation centers on something called subduction termination, the process by which a subduction zone gradually ceases to function as one coherent system. According to this research, it happens when a spreading ridge, the undersea mountain range where new oceanic crust forms, approaches too close to the trench where subduction occurs. Newly formed oceanic crust near a spreading ridge is young, warm, and comparatively buoyant and weak, so it resists being dragged down into the mantle the way older, colder, denser crust does. The plate effectively fights against the pull of the older, already sinking slab it's attached to, and something eventually has to give. In this case, what's giving is the plate itself, quite literally splitting into separate pieces, with the Explorer plate emerging as its own distinct microplate, rather than remaining a seamless extension of the larger Juan de Fuca system.